Welcome everyone, my name is Joseph Schwartz, and this is the 5 Primary Kinetic Chains Deep Dive. A little bit about me. I got into bodywork after a climbing accident in 1985 where I broke my talus. And that was my introduction to the therapeutic world and the processes of both manual muscle testing and therapeutic exercise. Really, the 5 Primary Kinetic Chains is an amalgam of about 30 years of my experience. What's super interesting about the 5 Primary Kinetic Chains is that there is a relationship, much like in mythology, where once you recognize one particular layer, another layer will reveal itself. And that comes about in many different ways. First off, there's a couple of differences between the desktop edition and the posters. The biggest difference is on the desktop edition, the charts are substantially bigger so that they're much easier to read. The desktop edition has all the pages are laminated, so it's a great reference for in a clinical setting. The wall charts have an advantage where the illustrations are larger, so it's wonderful to be able to look at when you're working on a client to get an idea of, oh, let's check this, how this subsystem is connecting to this prime driver, or for client education. The main reason why I created these charts was to help you as therapists gain more insight and clarity on how kinetic energy moves through the body. So this is a very different perspective than a structural perspective that would be how fascial compartments would be connecting with each other. And we'll be able to see that when we talk about the deep longitudinal, or excuse me, the posterior spiral kinetic chain, how the chart is very different than a traditional, say, anatomy trains chart. These charts are based on Audrey Fleming's core subsystems. In the late 80s, Dr. Fleming postulated how these core subsystems stabilize the lumbar pelvis in locomotion. And so people that were coming in with lumbar pelvis pain syndromes, they were able to identify the muscles that needed to be functioning and acting on these joints to create stability. Now, over the years, there's been different vernacular used for how muscles act on structure, creating integration. One of the earlier words that they would use would be a force transmission system or force couplers. Recently, kinetic chains have become very popular. And they're all good, and they're all pointing to the same thing, that structure acts together to unify the whole. And that's a very important concept because we can't isolate muscles or parts of the structure. We work as an integrated whole. Our charts have some really interesting features. Let me get a different color chart. I'm going to use the deep longitudinal chart here. So can you all see this? Or perhaps you have your own charts in front of you. Yeah? So if you notice, these charts are broken up into 3 different hues of colors. The deepest, darkest hue are the core subsystem muscle groups. The next lighter hue, those are the prime movers. And then the lightest hue, those are the synergists. Now, if you look at the key here, we also have the hashtag, the hash mark color scheme. Those are connective tissue structures. I'm calling them fascial springs because specifically in locomotion, our connective tissue winds up or coils so that it can uncoil in the complementary opposite. When that happens efficiently and effectively, the muscles do not have to work so hard. So what that really means is, if there is a player that is not acting on the structure to coil this elastic energy into the fascial spring, muscles will become overworked. So there's a couple of reasons why I use different colors in the charts rather than the typical anatomy charts that are more of a monotone, natural muscle color. The biggest reason is that when I was in college and I took biology, my teacher, he would do all of his lectures on the board in color pen, and each system had its own color. And for my brain, it was a wonderful way of learning. And so as I've talked to other people, they've had similar experiences where different colors and the way that colors integrate, they act on our brain differently. Interestingly, one of the brain tools that I like to use in a way of keeping my brain tuned up is something that's called Sudoku. And Sudoku is a number game. They also have colored Sudoku in that it's not numbers, but it's just colors. And I learned something very interesting by going between the two. When we give an association to a color, our brain is able to process it. Just the color itself isn't enough information. And so when we utilize the different colors in the charts, that actually helps us cement into our brain, going from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere, the information. One of the unique things about the charts, other than the way that we've used color and coding to illustrate how these different systems of muscle groups act on one another, is something that I call the principal actions. Each chain has its own principal action. There are 5. And they're broken down into 2 main subgroups. The first subgroup is the dynamic platform. And that is our breathing apparatus, our shock absorption system, and the complement of our shock absorption system is how we respond to shock absorption, which is through ground force reaction. Those 3 elements create the dynamic platform so that we can store and release elastic energy. This is what gives our appendicular skeleton the platform to work off of our core so that we can develop power, speed, and agility. So there's a couple of things about the charts that we need to clarify. I'm going to start with the intrinsic kinetic chain. So if you pull up your intrinsic kinetic chain chart, you can see how the deeper color is the core system, the core subsystems, and the lighter color becomes the next level of prime movers. And then those prime movers have their synergists. The way that we would use these charts in evaluation is we would start with the core subsystems. We would look if the core subsystems have capacity to respond to movement appropriately. And there's many different ways that we can do this. One of which is through different manual muscle testing strategies, or we can use, in this case, we can use our breath and breathing apparatus. If we look at how the transverse abdominis and the multifidus are paired, those two are functional opposites. Now, if we look at our phases of breath, the inhalation phase is extension with external rotation. That would mean that the thoracic diaphragm is moving downward in contraction. The fibers are shortening. And it's going to be paired with the multifidus. Those are synergists. On the exhalation phase, the pelvic floor is moving upward and it is in contraction. And the transverse abdominis is cinching the corset of our core. They're synergists. Now, what's interesting is how they're functional opposites. So if we think about the thoracic diaphragm and the pelvic floor, there are two diaphragms that are stacked on one another. As the thoracic diaphragm is moving downward in concentric action, the pelvic floor is moving downward in eccentric activation. So the pelvic floor fibers are lengthening. And the converse is true on the exhalation phase. As the thoracic diaphragm is moving upward in eccentric action, the pelvic floor is moving upward in concentric action. This sync of the diaphragm is very, very important. What happens is there is a reflex in our body that's called the startle response. And the startle response is opposite to this normal breathing cycle of how these diaphragms sync. The startle reflex would be internal rotation to protect the core and a sharp exhalation or a sharp inhalation to brace and build intra-abdominal pressure. That is opposite of the external rotation inhalation, internal rotation exhalation of a normal breath in what would be a parasympathetic breath. So the startle reflex is a sympathetic breath where our sympathetic nervous system is arming to protect us from perceived harm. It may be real or it may be perceived. This is one of the things that is so prevalent in our stress reward society, is that many of us are stuck in this sympathetic state and our breathing apparatus is out of sync. This is why it's not only the first kinetic chain, but it's the kinetic chain that binds them all, meaning without having a healthy breathing apparatus, we're not going to have capacity to build these other chains so that we can have good quality functional movement. And so we want to start with that. Now there's a couple of interesting things about the charts here with the synergists. If we look at the breathing apparatus, there are 4 main diaphragms that need to sync up. We've talked about the thoracic diaphragm, which is, when people say diaphragm, that's often what they mean. And then the pelvic diaphragm. We have 2 others. The throat or the glottis acts as a diaphragm. This is also where our hyoid lives. Our hyoid is a very interesting bone. It is a bone that is neurologically very similar to the talus, but they're opposite. The talus is a bone in our ankle, it's the tarsal, that does not have any muscles attached. It only has ligaments. The hyoid is the opposite. The hyoid doesn't have any ligaments that attach to it. It just has muscles. And so when we think about fight, flight, or freeze, the hyoid is what comes to mind. This is why in the animal kingdom, a predator will take out its prey by taking out its hyoid, or go for the neck, go for the throat, because when you impel the breathing, your prey's ability to breathe, you take away their ability to have nervous system response. The next diaphragm up is the sphenoid, which is part of the cranial rhythm. The sphenoid acts in the same direction as the other diaphragms. So as the thoracic diaphragm is moving downward, and we're pressurizing the intra-abdominal or the intrathoracic pressure, so that the lungs, which are actually just sponges, can absorb air. The pressure goes down so that the atmospheric pressure can fill. The sphenoid closes its gap on its joint so that that pressure system isn't leaked. And the converse is true on the exhalation. And so all these points that we've talked about in the structure, and if we look at the charts, we can look at how the cranial bones are affecting our breath. We can look at how the jaw is affecting our breath. The jaw is often paired with the pelvic floor. How our throat and our glottis, the stability of our neck, our scalenes. Our scalenes are part of our upper register. Our scalenes lift the rib cage up. I've worked with a lot of pulmonary patients that have been given the instruction to breathe from their diaphragm, and they lose the ability to use their rib cage to assist in creating this negative intrathoracic pressure so that the air can rush in, and then they become diaphragm dominant, and it actually impedes their ability. Now, interestingly, asthmatics are the opposite. Asthmatics have trouble with the exhalation phase, so that could become the next inhalation phase. So they can't exhale, 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 so that the inhalation can happen. And so looking at this from a holistic perspective of who's playing, who's dominant, and who's not playing is very, very important. And that's really what all these charts are about, is looking at who are the players, can we evaluate and assess each player, who's dominant, who's not in the game, what can we do then to get who's not in the game back in the game. Any questions on the breathing apparatus? Yeah.
We don't have any yet shorts, but just so you know, the desktop is a little low, so we're not really, it's not, yeah.
Thank you. So as we can see from the desktop, there's a lot more information on the desktop that would be in the wall chart. So the wall charts have about, it's about a 4-to-1. So I highly recommend the desktop for your own educational process. The wall charts are great for client education. So if we think about continue the process of what are the 5 primary kinetic chains based on? They're based on the walking gait. The walking gait is the universal translator of movement. Basically, all 206 bones move when we walk. Classically, we start the walk with strike. I've broken down these charts into 4 phases that match with the 5 subsystems. So 4 of the subsystems are the 4 phases. The shock absorption phase, or the strike phase of the gait, is the next principal action. When we engage the ground, each joint must have capacity to absorb the kinetic energy that our bodies generate in movement. If a joint does not have that capacity, then a couple things will happen. One is the joint will become compressed as a mechanism to protect. That's the first line of defense. The next line of defense is muscles will start to tighten and compress with it to hold that joint into place. And if that's not enough, then we start to have what I would call structural adaptation, where the connective tissue structures will start to change to further support that joint in its compressive state that is a protection mechanism. When we start to look at how the energy flows up, because we have just completed the swing phase, our ankle has gone from this place of supination, ready to absorb energy, into pronation. And so the energy then will move up the lateral leg. And it moves up the lateral leg into the short head of the bicep femoris. From there, the energy is going to continue to travel through more connective tissue structures where it connects. It goes from the short head to the long head of bicep femoris to the ischium of tuberosity, into the sacrotuberous ligament, into the sacroiliac joint. It will cross over to the opposite side of the structure and up the opposite side of the structure. Now, what's interesting here is because of the amount of information that the nervous system receives from shock absorption and how ligaments and the connective structures are responding, those information tracks are going through what's called the spinocerebellar tract. What that means is that information is going directly to the cerebellum, not into the limbic system or the thalamus. It is non-felt sense. So ligament response, which actually is how our nervous system switches muscles on and off, is part of our non-felt sense kinesthetic sense, right? So we're familiar with proprioception. Proprioception is our felt sense. Those are primarily from, we get that information from our skin receptors and from our muscle spindles and the Golgi receptors in the tendons. But the Golgi receptors in ligaments, those are part of our kinesthetic sense that we're responding to in a non-felt sense way. And this becomes very important for our assessment because muscles are only following the information that the nervous system is sending out how to respond to the changing environment. And that information is being received, the majority, by these non-felt sense receptors. If we look at the chart, there's a couple of really interesting things that are happening. First is, when we look at the deep longitudinal system, the first action is how we're controlling our fibula. The ability for our fibula to have rotary capacity in conjunction with our talus is the first joint that has to respond to shock absorption. If our fibula is not able to respond, there's a couple of ways that you could see that. One is people don't have a supination phase. They're stuck in pronation. Another way is when they have a very tight and painful posterior tibialis, that contraction of the posterior tibialis is supporting the connective tissue of the interossi that is holding the fibula in place. The fibula should have the ability to roll, and if it doesn't, shock absorption is going to be impaired. Then as we see that that energy is then going to move through the thigh so that it can move through the pelvis. And so we see a lot of knee injuries. Now, knee injuries happen for a couple of different reasons. One is because the ankle is not responding to shock absorption like it should. And the other is the pelvis isn't responding to ground force reaction like it should. So that's the difference of energy moving up and the counter energy that balances the energy moving up with energy moving down. When we're using our muscle testing strategies, these charts become very helpful because we can individually assess how these muscles are responding when we understand the joint movement and how those joints should move. One of the things that we want to do when we're using our muscle testing strategies is to be sure to look at how the muscles are responding in three major positions: when the muscle is closed, when the muscle is in the middle position, and when the muscle is closed. We want to be able to see how that range of contraction is being affected by this nervous system response. And when we find a position in which the nervous system is unable to respond, then we can get out our toolbox to find out why. And we can go through these charts, muscle group by muscle group, and assess this, and we can start to look for the common denominator. We have if we look at how the energy moves up the structure, it moves all the way up through our cranium. It moves all the way up through our cranium, through our levator scapula. The levator scapula is one of those very important stabilizing muscles. The levator scapula is to the scapula as the psoas is to the pelvis, or as the scalenes are to the neck. It's a multi-segmental muscle. You can feel this if you do a one-legged plyometric jump, where you jump off the ground. And so what you're doing there is you're increasing the shock absorption, and you can start to feel how that shock absorption will go farther up the kinetic chain. Because essentially what we're looking for in shock absorption is the load being spread out by all the joints and all the connective tissue. As you increase the load, more joints and connective tissue need to become involved. Shock absorption and ground force reaction are two opposite forces. So ground force reaction, if shock absorption is moving up, ground force reaction is moving downward. What ground force reaction does is it creates the stability in the axial skeleton. And it does that in a very unique way. If we look at the chart, the core subsystem is the adductor magnus, the glute medius, and the contralateral quadratus laborum. Those muscles are forming a triangle. This triangle creates the stability in the pelvis so that the spine can rise up. So there's a function called leg drive. As the leg drive is moving down, the spine is moving upward. And this is very important. Without having this ability, gravity would compress us. And so when we think of the force of gravity on the earth, we're under constant load. Our bones and joints need that load to be healthy. They found with astronauts and people that are in zero gravity conditions, they lose the ability to have the osteoblast build up in their bones. They lose the integrity of their bones. And so we need gravity. And this is also why loading joints or loaded exercise is so beneficial, is because the compressive forces, our response to compressive force is expansive, and that builds tissue. And we need solid tissue that can respond to a changing environment. Much like if I jump off a plyo box onto the earth, I have to absorb that energy, and then I have to rebound and recoil with equal energy to balance out those two energy equations. when we start to look at the dynamics of this triangle, of the core subsystem, it seems like it would be a frontal plane action, but it's not. So we often think of the glute med as an abductor, or the quadratus laborum as a hip hiker, or the adductor magnus as an adductor. In reality, these work in all three planes simultaneously. So while we call it the lateral kinetic chain, the reality is this chain has to be able to support movement in all three planes of motion. And so that also means that we can start looking at our movement assessment strategies from that viewpoint. Does the pelvis have the ability to go through flexion extension, which would be the sagittal plane of motion? Does it have the ability to go through frontal plane? Does it have the ability to go through transverse plane? Now, I like to use the words pitch, roll, and yaw, which comes from early chiropractic text that was taken from the way aviation will describe motion of a plane. It actually, in my brain, it works easier to say pitch rather than flexion, extension, sagittal plane, or roll, lateral flexion or coronal plane, or yaw rather than transverse plane and the rotary component. One of the reasons why pitch, roll, and yaw is a more accurate word is that when we start looking at rotary action, it's a changing angle of an arc. And pitch, roll, and yaw embodies that movement along a plane. Like, for example, right now, to relationship to me, I'm holding this plane of the book is what would be in the coronal plane. If I take an arc and I move it along that plane, the point of center is changing. It's not equal, it's not one point of center. And that's the way that our bodies move. Even though the joint may seem like that it's one point that we're moving around, but because we're moving in multiple joints at the same time, the arc is changing, and so it becomes easier to utilize that terminology. So we have the breathing apparatus, our shock absorption system, and our axial stability, which is our ground force reaction. This creates this dynamic platform. And this dynamic platform is absolutely necessary so that our appendicular skeleton can then generate work. Meaning, work production starts from the core to the extremity and back from the extremity to the core. This is how we coil stored elastic energy, which is the fourth principal action, which is coiling stored elastic energy into I call it the master spring or the lumbar dorsal fascia. And this is where the glutes and the lat, the contralateral lat, are acting together in a rotary component. So there's a lot of transverse plane that's happening here. You have the transverse plane of the leg drive rotating on the hip. You have the transverse plane of the torso, which is opposite, acting on the lumbar, and the lumbar dorsal fascia is in between the two. If any of these players aren't acting on the lumbar dorsal fascia, the potential for stored elastic energy is going to be impaired. There's a few more very interesting things about the posterior kinetic chain. Let's start with the difference here between leg drive and fascial meridians. So the fascial meridians would be including the posterior leg, the posterior thigh, the glutes, and the posterior back. We don't have that here, do we? What we have is functional opposites that are acting as synergists. So we have the posterior leg, the gastroc, the soleus, plantaris. They're acting with the quadricep muscles. So we've got this energy that is moving from the back of the body to the front of the body, back to the back of the body. This is actually a very important aspect of leg drive. This is a force coupler. And this is something that's unique about the 5 primary kinetic chains, is the way that we've depicted this force coupler. The other aspect are what I call the 4 fascial springs and how they are working together to store the elastic energy. We've already talked about the master spring, which is the lumbar dorsal fascia. The next spring is the iliotibial band. Now, if we notice the iliotibial band, here's something that's very interesting. If we think about leg drive and going into the supination phase to get what becomes the push phase of the gait, our leg is in external rotation. The glute max is a synergist to external rotation along with the hip rotators. The tensor fascia lata is a functional opposite. Many hip problems, the tensor fascia lata is a core root source because the tensor fascia lata doesn't have the ability to lengthen or have eccentric control, which allows us to store and coil elastic energy into the TFL, or excuse me, the iliotibial band. So we've got the lumbar dorsal fascia, iliotibial band. The next fascial spring is the Achilles tendon. The Achilles tendon is what allows us to translate energy from our feet to our leg. The Achilles tendon is the connective tissue sheath that our soleus and our gastroc attach to. It's one of the more vulnerable places in the body. If you have an Achilles tendon injury, you can't walk. That means you can't evade a predator if we weren't in modern times. The fourth spring is our plantar aponeurosis. Now, the plantar aponeurosis is very important for how our toe flexors are acting on our tarsals, which in turn acts on our leg, which in turn acts with our thigh, which in turn acts with our hip, which in turn coils elastic energy into our lumbar dorsal fascia, which in turn is being acted on by the torso and the contralateral arm drive or arm spiral. When we start to look at certain kinds of injuries, like people that come into you with, say, IT band pain, you want to look at the relationship of their hip flexors. Can the psoas, the iliacus, the gracilis, the pectineus, the adductor longus, the tensor fascia lata, can all those muscles, and the sartorius, of course, as well, can all those muscles play with one another? Do they have capacity to act on their own? And can they engage and play with their synergists? What you'll find often is you'll find a dominant inhibited tensor fascia lata, and that's going to be impairing the iliotibial band from storing and releasing elastic energy. And then those Golgis that are in those connective tissues send signals to the brain, and then the noses get activated and you get pain there. Very, very common. And so what we want to do is we want to balance out the hip flexors so that we can get the IT band to do its job again, storing and releasing elastic energy. Similarly, we have the plantar aponeurosis. Plantar fasciitis is epidemic. Now, oftentimes what's happening there is the toes become dominant and the rest of the kinetic chain isn't participating. So we have to look for who's not participating in the rest of the kinetic chain. What does that need to get back in the game again so the toes don't have to be so overworked? When we think about coiling elastic energy, there's two aspects to that. The first aspect is one side of the spiral, tissues are shortening. That's the coiling side. The opposite side of the spiral, tissues are lengthening. That is where the elastic energy is being stored. The coiling is the active. The lengthening is the eccentric portion that, I'm not going to say passive, even though in some ways it is more passive, but it's actively storing the elastic energy. And so if we look at the posterior spiral, if you look at the functional opposite, you'll see the anterior spiral in its most open position. It is eccentrically lengthening as the posterior spiral is concentrically shortening. This is what's going to allow that translation of stored elastic energy into the next contractive phase. So this is a very important concept. When we have coiling of tissues, and the opposite is the storing of tissues, that's not realized until that energy is translated into the complementary movement. In the walking gait, that complementary movement is the swing phase of the gait. If the posterior spiral was the push phase, the anterior spiral is the swing phase. Here, that coiling that we spoke about earlier, or the storing of the elastic energy into the hip flexors, becomes very, very important. And where does it start with? Our toe off. It starts with our toe off and it moves through our anterior compartment up through our adductors, into our hip flexors. All the while, that is supported by the core corset of our abdominal region, in which we have our obliques and our transverse abdominis. We have our rectus femoris, or excuse me, rectus abdominis, and the multifidus is the zipper in the back. This is how we generate the rotary action of the torso, moving from phase to phase in our gait. So we have the internal oblique is working with the contralateral external oblique. They're synergists. So let's talk a little bit about why we want to know what synergists mean. So these are how muscles need to work together to create these movement slings or kinetic chains. They force couple. They're what creates the energy transmission. If synergists are unable to cooperate or play with each other, that means then that the nervous system is going to find a workaround or a compensation to get the job done. That compensation is not going to be ideal, it's not going to be efficient, and it probably is not going to be sustainable. And so the best way of utilizing these charts is to look at, can these players function individually, and can these players function as a team? Now there's another lens that we can look through, and that's the lens of global, local, global. When we stimulate the system in a global way, it's going to cue up the nervous system to its preferred strategy. That preferred strategy may be functional, appropriate, or not. And when it's not, that then gives us the opportunity to vet out all the individual components, who's playing and who's not playing. Whoever's not playing, let's get them back in the game again. Reinsert that into the global movement. How did that global movement change? Did it go from a dysfunctional movement to a functional movement? These charts give us a map of how to do that. Now, one of the things about these charts is that they are specifically tailored to the walking gait. Human locomotion is much more complex than just the walking gait. This then is a map for the walking gait, but it also then becomes a template. It becomes a template on how we can utilize this to look at other movements. For example, let's take swimming. Swimming, we have a movement, it's called the spear phase. The spear phase would be analogous to the deep longitudinal or the strike phase of the gait. But instead of the energy route moving from the posterior, from the foot up, it's moving anterior from the hand to the core or down. And so we want to take in consideration the movement paradigm that our clients are engaged in. What is their sport? First, we want to look at, do they have basic activation of these core subsystems and these kinetic chains? Then we want to get more specific to their activity. And that's going to require being creative. And so when I talked earlier about how these charts will have different layers that will reveal themselves, that's what I'm talking about when I say that it's a template. And the template that we're going to follow is, can we breathe? Can we absorb energy in movement or shock absorption? Can we turn that shock absorption into the dynamic stability needed so that we can store and release elastic energy? And with that template, we can look at how structure is responding to movement. That's not the whole picture, because we have our experiences, our associations, our emotions, our feelings that are also affecting movement. We also have physiological factors such as our endocrine system, how our organs are functioning, our vitamin mineral uptake and elimination, our lymphatic system, which is another one of those passive pumps systems in the body in which movement is the pump. And so if these kinetic chains don't have appropriate response and function, our lymphatic system is going to be impeded as well from that. And on the other side of that coin is, if we have a problem in one of the lymph junctions where lymph flow is impeded, it's going to affect our movement as well. And so these charts can become a map to look at the benchmark of movement, though there are other considerations that we want to take into our sphere of looking at how the body is moving and how we're responding to our environment. What's happening with our emotional environment? There's a very popular term that's called the social psychofactors that's related to pain, and how our psychology and our social circles and our support mechanisms and the experiences that we've had in our life and how we've had to adapt to those experiences, how those are affecting our pain response and our capacities. Now, movement is one of those ways that we can alter our capacity to respond to our environment. However, sometimes we have to first address another component before we can actually get to the movement. And you may have had this experience where you're working on a client and you're looking at how these muscles are functioning together, and yet there's something that's impeding you from getting a muscle or a function of movement to restore. And that's because it's not all structure. There are other factors.